Welcome to Cow Talks. This is Marcelo Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida. And this is our podcast, where we dive into the main topics affecting livestock and forage production in the southeastern United States. Join us in this journey as we tackle the main issues affecting our producers and the sustainability of our production systems. Hello and welcome to Cow Talks. This is Marcelo Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist and Associate Program Leader with the University of Florida. Today my guest is Dr. Nicolas Caram. Nico has graduated from our program here about a year ago and has done a lot of great research in legume forage management in general. Today, Nico is an assistant professor at the University of the Republic in Uruguay with the Pasture Research Group. Nico, welcome to Cow Talks.
Thanks, Marcelo. It's my pleasure being here.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you back here. So this is our research in perspective. This is a segment of the Cow Talks that is highlighting some of the research we have been doing here with our team and try to get that research out of the research papers only and into the public, to the people that are actually using and benefiting from the research we develop. Nico has done some fantastic research studying the importance of legumes in grass-based pastures and also trying to identify what is the ideal proportion of that legume, what's the function of that legume, and how it affects pasture productivity and animal performance. Nico, tell us a little bit more about the research you developed here during the years of your PhD.
Absolutely. So before getting into that point, I should credit this idea to Dr. Lynn Sollenberger. In one of our first meetings, he came up with this idea of identifying an optimum legume proportion for maximizing different outcomes. And I thought that would be a really nice question to be addressed. And that's because we typically used to consider, mixtures, again, monocultures, but it's not that common that we consider that gradient of species or species balance in case we have more than two, where we could target management to optimize different proportions that may drive different or opposite outcomes. And so, we decided, I took the idea and we decided to carry out a grazing trial where basically our main goal was to identify if there is any optimum legume proportion in our pastures here in Florida, which were C4 grasses based. And with that, we measured many outcomes that at the end translate into our producers' outcomes, meaning animal gain, live weight gain per acre, and also primary productivity in terms of forage production.
It was a very interesting proposition because when you say, what is the proportion of legume in a pasture, I think a lot of the producers are going to say, as much as possible, right?
Yeah, that's a typical answer. So even from our perspective, from the research perspective, we have the idea of let's maximize, or what is the management that we can maximize? Legumes, as we see it as the target species in our system. But when you get into that point, at least we saw that, there is a optimum balance. We need legumes, but not that much. We need grasses, not that much. So at the end, there is a balance that maximizes different mechanisms and different processes that are occurring in grazing systems that derive in optimum productivity levels.
So let's break down this conversation into the different components and the importance. So the impact of your research is broad, not only specific to the crops you worked with, but just for the reference in terms of Florida and what we're doing, what are the two crops you've been working with in terms of grass and legume?
So our experiment was Bahia grass based, which is a C4 grass, Paspalum notatum, for us from South America, and in mixture with a tropical perennial legume, which is a rhizoma peanut, perennial peanut, or Arachis glabrata. That legume is quite perennial for us that we used to call perennials for legume that stand for 3-4 years, but this stand was established in 1983, so it's very perennial for us. It was about 40 years. At the end, we took the advantage of having different fields that had different proportion of legumes in mixture with the Bahia grass. So Bahia grass it was naturalized in Florida because of its tolerance for high grazing intensities, low fertilization levels, and the environment of the state. When you want to increase the productivity of Bahia grass, you can take two pathways. One is to add nitrogen as fertilizer, and the other pathway would be to incorporate a species such as legumes that are end-fixing and capture nitrogen from the atmosphere. That's typically a more environmental friendly practice, more economically practice, and from productivity drives, it determines a greater animal gain and gain per hectare.
You mentioned some of the important things, and a lot of the times people are going to go, okay, what's the economics? Because legumes are very expensive to establish, especially perennial peanut. And this is probably a question to the end, but you brought it up now. Many folks are going to say, like, okay, perennial peanut is way too expensive to establish. I can buy a lot of nitrogen for that pasture with the same price I'm going to put into planting perennial peanut. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, we know that a pure stand of perennial peanut is about $2,000 per hectare or $1,000 per acre. So it's very expensive, and the producers are not willing to put that money into the field with a high risk, which you typically don't see with the nitrogen as fertilizer. So you're relying on an indirect method to overcome that nitrogen limitation of the system through a species that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So you can take two pathways. One pathway is to incorporate a legume, which you're assuming that, or you're relying on that species that through symbiosis with a bacteria will capture that nitrogen and overcome the nitrogen limitation of the system. Mm-hmm. The other scenario is lower risk. So you're including that nitrogen as fertilizer, but has some implications relative to the environment, relative to the economics, and with that, the producer may have to decide which pathway to take in order to increase the overall productivity of the system.
I remember one of the things Dr. Sullenberger mentioned. He said, you mix peanut on that Bahia grass and you never are going to need to fertilize it with nitrogen anymore. Yeah, it costs a lot of money, but when you think that you are putting 80, 100, 120 pounds of nitrogen in that pasture, hopefully twice a year, with the price of nitrogen today, it does not take a lot of time to pay back that investment. And I think there is another very, very big component of that, which is there is just so much animal gain that you can put on Bahia grass.
Yeah. Since we identified that you don't need 100% pure stand legume, meaning that you don't have to establish a $2,000 per hectare, okay, you decide to strip plant in half the area. So in that case, you are reducing half the price of establishing a unit of pasture. What we found is that the productivity in terms of animal gain increases from 0.7, 0.8 pounds per animal per day up to 1.3, 1.4 during the growing season, 4 or 5 months during the spring, summer, and early fall. And that translates into increases in animal gain per area from 150, 180 pounds per acre to 350, 380 pounds per acre during the growing season.
And with a quick economic analysis you did, it paid off pretty quickly,
it really
right?
paid off. Yeah, we did some very nice economical analysis of the initial investment and how many years you need to pay off that investment. And what we found was that at the second year, you already paid that investment, strip planting the rhizoma peanut or perennial peanut into a Bahia grass field.
Just because of that increase in productivity.
And let me mention something that is not typically discussed in our area, which is, when we compare systems in terms of animal productivity, we used to compare, both Bahia grass with a very high nitrogen fertilizations may produce the same amount of beef as a Bahia and rhizoma peanut.
Per acre, yeah.
But the point is how you get to the 350 pounds per acre. You can either get that point with 0.7, 0.8 pounds per animal per day or with 1.3, 1.4. And that is quite different in terms of environmental footprint that both systems may have, regardless of the impacts that may have the direct nitrogen fertilization. So it's not only the environmental impact of the nitrogen fertilization per se, but also how you get to that productivity in terms of methane emissions and productivity during the growing season for the animals themselves.
Yeah, and I think very practical for our producers. When do you want to breed that heifer?
Yeah.
Simple as that, because you are putting that over 1 pound a day in the peanut, you're going to be able to breed that heifer at 14 months, 16 months. And if you were on the standards 0.8 pounds of gain per day, it is going to stretch it to your chew before you can breed that animal, before that animal reaches breeding weight.
And, we carried out open cows during the summer, very warm, and cows gained 1.4 pounds per day. And those were 700 pounds per head, so of live weight during the summer. So it's a pretty amazing animal gain and gain per area that you can get with those mixtures. So we measured animal gain, which is of producers' interest, but also when we measure that biological nitrogen fixation, so the nitrogen that legumes can fix from the atmosphere, we measure values of about 100 and 140 kilos per hectare, or which is pretty much
Pounds
the
per
same,
acre.
pounds per acre. If you had to put that money into a fertilizer, not even in considering the environmental impact of that practice, but just in terms of money, it's a lot of money that legumes are putting into the system. And at the end, we found that the target is 30%. So we with just 30% of legumes in terms of cover, it's enough for achieving those more than 100% increase levels.
So it's almost kind of a no-brainer, right?
Yeah.
We really went to the bottom line because I think that's important to go like, what does that really mean? But tell us a little bit more about the trial and what you really found out in this gradient of going from grass only to a high grass legume gradient.
So this trial was carried out here in Gainesville during 22 and 23. So there we have 8 pastures. We have a priori identified that they may have different legume proportions. So once we cover this range from 0% legume to 60% legume, once you put legumes, the main driver is the nitrogen that legumes can fix from the atmosphere. So when we measured the nitrogen fixation from legumes, we measured values from 100 to 140 pounds per acre during the growing season. That translated into increases from 3,000 pounds per acre to 8,000 pounds per acre of dry matter production. And in terms of overall animal productivity or pounds per acre, meant increases from 150 to 380 pounds per acre, and individual gains from 0.7 to 1.3, 1.4 pounds per animal. We not only measured the legume proportion in the pasture, but also the legume proportion in the diet of the heifers. And that's a very interesting point, because all our results indicate that you should target, or a producer should target, 30%, 40% legume. It's not different, 30 to 40, right? That's a pretty good target for a system. What we measure at these levels of legumes in the pasture is that animals were able to select between 50 to 60% legume, meaning that under appropriate grazing management, heifers were able to select for the legume instead of the grass, so they kind of compensated that low proportion that you need in pasture, and that explains that real difference in animal gain relative to the only grass system.
That is very interesting. So for the animal, having a little more legume, because Bahia grass is still poor quality for most part, for the animal having a little more legume would be beneficial. But you don't need more legume in the pasture to get the animal benefit, because the animal selects it. From the pasture perspective, having more legume limits the total production of the pasture, because the legume is less productive than the grass. But having less legume, then you are limiting the nitrogen. So that's how we got to that 30 to 40% legume proportion in the pasture, where we get both the benefit of the total production of the system from the forage side, and then the best production of the animal, because you're merging quantity and quality there.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
That's a good way to summarize it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's very important, because even having very, very high proportion of legumes, as we a priori may think, well, that's a very nice scenario, I should target 60, 70% legume. Our results indicate that, well, perhaps it's not that good as you may think. That is, what is happening there is a physiological limitation, where we have too many legumes in an environment where it's not. So you should have 30, 40, but not 60 or 70, because the legumes are less adapted to this very warm environment relative to the grass.
That is just, it is fantastic. Such a cool research, and very simple and applied concepts that can really help us better manage our pasture. Talking about management, the first point about establishing legumes is too expensive. The second point is too hard to manage. We don't want legumes because it becomes too hard to manage. What has been your experience managing those?
Well, I should say that for me it was quite easy to manage those legumes. We had the advantage that those legumes were already established since 1980s. Well, we just put the animals there. We keep track of the forage mass to keep track, or to maintain our forage allowance within the target. But the continuous stocking was much easier to manage this experiment relative, in case we have a rotational stocking. If you don't want 60, 70% legume, perhaps in that you don't want to go to a legume dominated scenario, but you don't have to go to, or you don't want to go to a grass dominated scenario neither. If you're going to a legume dominated site, that is likely meaning that the grasses are undernourished in terms of nutrient and mostly nitrogen. So in that case, a nitrogen fertilization would help to balance the mixture toward a 30-40% legume. If you are going to a scenario where you have too much grass, perhaps what you need to do is think in phosphorus fertilization and optimize the grazing management to favor that legume proportion. And of course, you shouldn't fertilize with nitrogen in that scenario.
Yeah, I think a lot of the people that have the peanut also are concerned about weed management. That's one of the main questions I get is how to kill this, how to kill that. And indeed, it's going to be a little more complicated to have the weed management. And we experience some of that. And many times it needs spot spray, it needs mowing and other things. But I think it's just a matter of adapting to those different management practices. And we also have the opportunity for off-season weed control, because when peanut goes dormant, some of the weeds are still active, especially perennial ones, and then they can be controlled. One of the things that we didn't study in our case here, because specifically in the summer side, but that system, results from Dr. Dubé and Mariana, show that whenever you come and oversee that Bahia perennial peanut mix with cool season forage, and especially if you include some legumes there, you can really have a part of a system where you're capitalizing that legume over time and adding a lot of weight in cattle, both in the summer and in the winter, with a much lower cost of production than systems relying specifically on nitrogen fertilization because it's so expensive. Another thing that, Nico, is important to talk about, and we talked about this in other podcasts, specifically, we recently had a revisit of a Forage Nexus podcast that we released in Cow Talks 2 with Dr. Mir and Dr. Jamie Foster, both talking independently about legumes in pastures. And then there is this idea that I put a legume there and automatically I don't need to put more nitrogen because the nitrogen is coming from the legume and is going to give to the grasses. And I remind people that the nitrogen does not come for free. It comes at the cost of the legume. The legume is not going to give out the nitrogen. So it's important to understand that nitrogen is added to the system.
It's a good point. If you have to balance the mixture, perhaps you have to fertilize with nitrogen at some point.
Especially in the beginning, you might need a little bit of that nitrogen support to be able to get production going. Nico, I want to talk a little bit about something else you mentioned, which is another component of your research. And you said something to the tune of, we really had good gains in that cattle, even in the middle of the summer. What does that mean? What you were expecting? They were not supposed to gain well in the middle of the summer on Bahia grass?
Well, no, but Bahia grass has some characteristics that are associated with the digestibility and crude protein, but mostly digestibility, where during the middle of the summer, there is a summer slump in animal gain grazing Bahia grass, which is associated with a decline in digestibility of Bahia grass leaves. And
this is super well documented. We've seen that in many different researches, both on the plant side and also on the animal side. We always have that reduction, that dip in animal productivity in the middle of the summer.
That's quite clear. And there is a lot of evidence and very well documented. What is happening is that as temperature rises, digestibility decreases of mostly for Bahia grass, something common for C4 grasses, but mostly for Bahia. That was a very short time experiment that we carried out here, which was, well, do we have any alternative to try to overcome that summer slump associated with a decline in digestibility? And for that, we were looking for a no-cost management, which would be, well, what is the grazing management that could potentially overcome that decline in digestibility? And so what we did was we clipped Bahia grass at 3 different stubble heights. And with that, our hypothesis is that taller the canopy height, the longer the leaf, and the longer the leaf, the lower the digestibility. With that, we found that perhaps at some point of the summer, increases in grazing intensity to short down that stubble height may offset that decline in digestibility. And with that, we shouldn't get to that summer slump in animal gain.
It's very interesting because normally this goes against some of the things we teach in pasture management, is that normally when you increase that grazing intensity, you can have very adverse effects because you're exposing the animals to lower quality forage, because you're forcing them to graze down. And that's normally associated with long regrowth periods and heavy grazing, like high removal rate.
Not for a long term. So in our case, was a short term strategic use of high grazing intensity that may ameliorate that decline in digestibility.
But and it's also not only the grazing intensity here in terms of how the leaf length, in terms of how much we're grazing down that, but is important to understand is also how often we can go back to that, right?
Yeah. So we did that every 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
We found that during during July and August, that increase in grazing intensity or shorter canopy height had a significant effect. Even the end of August had a significant effect, affecting the nutritive value and with that potential animal gain.
We didn't test animal gain on this trial, but I think there is a pretty clear pathway. So I don't think we're ready to recommend management practice based on that only. But if we were to think about management practice, just to translate to something that most producers can relate, would be if you're in a rotational grazing system, rotational stocking system, as we approach the summer, in the middle of the summer, have a more frequent grazing period where you're removing less of the plant, but keeping that plant shorter. Now, caveat here, we're talking about Bahia grass. Bahia grass is a completely different creature. Probably not the same effect as if we're looking into Bermuda grass or the bunch grasses, but just because of that growth habit of Bahia grass so close to the ground, lots of productivity there. It just sometimes, I think, it defies some of the management standards that we normally talk about.
That's what I like to call a opportunistic management. So
Yep.
you take the opportunity of the growth habit of the species. You take the opportunity that it's summer, it's the forest accumulation is very high, and you have to keep grazing that growth to not affect digestibility. With the caveat that, well, that was a small plot, but I think that we used to assume that, well, high grazing intensity is a bad word. So it depends.
Yeah.
Perhaps for short terms and for specific periods of the year. So we have the opportunity in Uruguay where increases in grazing intensity during winter may control some undesired species.
Oh, yeah.
It's a different objective, but at the end, we are using the same no-cost technology, grazing management, grazing intensity for specific periods of the year. So I think at least we have a objective to be tested at larger scale.
You bet. Dr. Wilson, Chris, and I have also been talking a lot about that type of management of how can we incorporate that. Interesting you mentioned about the weed control, because one of my colleagues from California submitted a paper we worked several years back. I was actually a modeling paper, but it's very interesting, with the use of grazing to reduce medusa head, which is a big invasive weed in the western United States. And through, let's call it very intentional managed grazing in specific time of the year, high intensity grazing there, you can really reduce that medusa head population and lead to control of medusa head. So target is important. That's why I don't like to talk about this grazing management and that grazing management. Is what is the objective here? There are many different ways to do it.
Yeah, they may not be aligned in a long term than in a short term. Your long term, it should be, well, let's keep this under a moderate grazing intensity, but perhaps in a short term, you may need a very high grazing intensity or very low, depending on the season, depending on the temperature, precipitation, and your goal for the next month in terms of animal gain. So, but it's something to consider. If we are able to overcome that summer slump just with a no-cost grazing management, that would be really great.
That would be fantastic, because that's, as I said, no cost is basically just management. And
Absolutely.
I think a lot of many pasture management strategies can start from that perspective. There is a lot that can be done without any cost. Adjusting the stocking rate, simple as that. And that can really increase productivity. I'm so eager to dive into the topic of grazing management, but it's not for this episode today, because it's going to be a long discussion. We need to have a whole series about grazing management. But anyhow, base of our thought in terms of grazing management here is making sure we have enough forage for cattle. Simple as that. And normally we're achieving that through moderate stocking rates, moderate grazing intensities. That's when we, in a very general sense, achieve the best outcomes. Then you can merge the different. Is it rotational? Is it continuous? Is it stockpile? Is it intensive or not? Stocking density, intensity. You merge those concepts and then you put together the system that works best for you.
Yeah, at the end, that's the what, the grazing intensity. The how, we have many options to get to that point.
Perfect. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Nico, I just would like to wrap up with our research in perspective, because you get so many cool things here. So what are the next steps here in terms of thinking about the grass legume dynamic in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think one interesting point to be elucidated is we have some hypotheses to, well, let's keep this 30-40% with fertilization or grazing management, but more target interventions would be very nice to, well, let's assume I have my field with 80% legume. How can I get to the 30-40? But we should measure that.
Yeah, how to manipulate
That balance toward the 30-40%, or the same, I have just 10%. It's just because I have 10%. How could I get to that 30-40%? Is that because I don't have enough phosphorus? It's just grazing management. How could I modify that grazing management to manipulate that species balance? The take home message is many times producers are not willing to make that initial investment, but at the end is even 10, 80, that would be much better than having nothing, and you will have that for 40 years or more, right?
Yeah, and as I said in the beginning, that initial investments pay back pretty quickly, especially with good cattle prices. Nico, really appreciate you coming here. It's so great to be recording this with you in person since you came to visit, and I wish you good travels around the US and good conference, and hope we can continue this discussion for us to come and evolve. For those that are more interested, Nico and I have, and Dr. Sollenberg have published several newsletter articles in the Panhandle Ag News and Cattlemen Association, Cattlemen Journal. Those are available if you want to take a look at those and learn more about the research that Nico has done. That's our research and perspective. Thank you so much, and don't forget to check the other episodes. This podcast was brought to you by the University of Florida Forage Team with technical support from the University of Florida College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, Faculty Instructional Resource and Support Team. This episode was produced by Marcelo Wallau, Olivia Mowley, and Ashley Kanabrowski. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast. If you have any comments or thoughts to share with us, please reach out to us through our email, forages@ifas.ufl.edu, and find us on our social media, uf.forages on Instagram, UF Forage Team on Facebook, or UF IFAS Forages on YouTube. We hope to see you in our next episode.